Turn-based tactic games have been a staple of video games for decades, but it's one that rarely gets the attention or recognition it deserves. It has some dedicated fans, but it's not the most mainstream genre. These games were ones I first discovered with Final Fantasy Tactics Advance for the Game Boy Advance, but even then, the genre was still old and had already gone through its awkward phases. It was comfortably stagnant. That's not to say it was bad. It wasn't. Some of my favorite games weren't even a glimmer in the eyes of the developers who were trying to find new ways to make chess sexy. But these games, in particular the ones where we control individual units, don't really have much room to innovate. They're timeless, and they don't really age much for better and worse. Sure, there were some growing pains very early on, and some more recent games have had options to make it an easier and less punishing experience, whether that be disabling certain difficult options, or even letting the player rewind to undo mistakes. While some games had already given me a taste, what really got me into these turn-based tactical games was a certain 3DS classic that showed me the depth of the genre, even if some of the older fans didn't appreciate me being a newcomer and casualizing it all up. I speak of course of Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon Shadow Wars. This is the unsung hero of that period of the 3DS where I had no games, and it was edgy enough that it appealed to an 18-year-old me. I loved this game, and then I didn't really think much about it, and then I played some other game that people really liked, and I liked it too, but not enough for it to take over my personality for years. Modern Fire Emblem games are a good gateway to this genre, as long as you don't mind the characters never shutting up. But they weren't a good enough gateway since global sales never reached what the developers wanted, and if you were a tactical game that didn't even have anime romance, your sales were even more abysmal. And that brings me to Codename Steam, a game that was made with the intention of finally breaking through to the American market properly, but it failed so miserably that copies littered bargain bins in no time. I bought my copy within the first few months of release, and mostly because I saw it going for practically nothing and I couldn't resist that. I knew that some people liked this game, and I knew it would be a cult classic eventually, and it would have to shoot up in value. At the time of speaking, the latter has definitely not happened yet. In fact, the price crashed way more and pretty much stayed that way. But this being a cult classic, maybe. It's still too early to say with certainty, but there are dozens of us that like this game, and I can imagine that number maybe even doubling in the next several years. But what authority do I have? I thought it would already be expensive by now. Codename Steam, or as it's known in Japan, Lincoln vs. Aliens, is a game straight out of Intelligent Systems, and they're a company I trust with tactics games. Some like Fire Emblem or the Wars series consisting of games like Famicom Wars and Advance Wars are their babies, and while obviously different development companies are full of their own individuals with different experience, the fact that this had Intelligent Systems branded to it was a good sign, although this game had a brand new director attached to it. This was their debut. I am really sorry. Without sounding too much like a teenage boy's favorite videos in 2018, this game has aesthetic. Codename Steam leans heavily into the American 1960s comic book look, and it's executed about as wonderfully as he could do on the 3DS. This is genuinely one of the prettiest games for the system, and if for nothing else, I wish it succeeded financially just off the back of this. Cutscenes use text onomatopoeias to further this, and because of all this theming, it turns mostly still slideshow cutscenes into something that truly works, and doesn't just look like the result of a lack of time or budget. I don't ever hate slideshow cutscenes, but I rarely love them or think about them. But these ones here in Codename Steam, I love them, and the consistent stylization carries the weight. So after I had already written most of the script and was doing the finishing touches, I somehow found myself in a conversation with someone who hates practically everything about this game, but first and foremost are its visuals. To him, this game was too blocky and flat looking. This was made for the 3DS, and even the best looking games had to cut corners due to how weak the hardware really is. But for better and worse, this game has an overbearing and divisive art style, and it never lets up. Sorry if you don't like that, read a plot synopsis while moving chess pieces around and just pretend you're playing. This game is soaked in this aesthetic, And while I personally love it, and I know I'm not alone in that, it did apparently strike a nerve with some people. And the game being divisive doesn't just end with the aesthetic, the gameplay too is something some people can't wrap their heads around. It's definitely an outlier in the genre even if it didn't invent this particular take on it. You can't throw a steam canister around without hitting another person comparing it to Sega's Valkyria Chronicles franchise. It's the most famous example of turn-based strategy and third-person shooting gameplay being combined into this weird mess that shouldn't work but does. But Codename Steam is different in so many ways, but it ultimately feels like two different games even if they look near identical to a layperson watching footage. Though even a layperson should be able to tell the settings are nothing alike. If anime World War II isn't your thing, then I'm here to offer a 1960s American comic book depiction of a steampunk 19th century war between public domain Americana characters and Lovecraftian horrors. The American Civil War is over, Lincoln is no longer the president, but Queen Victoria still reigns over her empire, and it's peacetime for these two countries. The populace are enjoying the modern luxuries of steam-powered technology, and this technology has evolved so rapidly that everything is broadcast on the wireless, and airships fly over everyone's top hats and bonnets. It's all great, but then aliens show up and not only do they kill people, but they cause immense property damage. This seems like a job for the strike team eliminating the alien menace, or STEAM for short. This is a secret organization run by Abraham Lincoln, who has actually been alive and living in secret after the apparent assassination. However, Lincoln is the man in charge. We don't actually play as him, usually. The actual agents are an eclectic group that consists of, as already mentioned, many characters from predominantly American stories that are old enough to be in the public domain. This game isn't concerned with whether these can work together or not, and the conceit of this all being a cheesy comic book means they don't have to make perfect sense. It's all fictional. Now be quiet as we lead characters like Tom Sawyer, the four leads of The Wizard of Oz, Randolph Carter, who is a character in H.P. Lovecraft's mythos, and Califia, from a 16th century story about the queen of an island named California, who fights a holy war against the Christians with her army of trained griffins. It is an eclectic group to say the least. Now it's only reasonable to ask yourself, how does any of this fit into a steampunk setting? And just say, I don't know, and roll with it. Even the characters question some of this. This is just a grab bag of characters, but what they lack in cohesion, they more than make up for in camaraderie and synergy. Although this diverse cast is certainly up to the task of being scrutinized, since characters people wrote hundreds of years ago don't really hold up to a modern lens, even when they've been reinterpreted for the 2010s. Some of these characters, for example, are just based on inaccurate stereotypes, but I'm not really the type of person you should be listening to about this. Read up on how people such as Indigenous Americans, for example, feel about portrayals like Tiger Lily from Peter Pan, who is one of the many characters here. All these characters still have complete in-game bios. Two of them, in fact. One is more factual, and the other is an opinion-based one from one of Lincoln's assistants. There is so much optional reading here to really flesh out the world, and while it's not required, it was great seeing all the lore they hid away, including the many references to Lovecraft's works. And while on the topic of these characters, for some reason the character names in text and audio weren't always one-to-one. I suspect this is the result of me playing a European release, where the localizers changed some names a little bit, but still left in North American audio. But that's only speculation on my part. I just know a lot of other people didn't have the same issue as me, so maybe I have some weird creepypasta haunted cartridge. But regardless, characters like Scarecrow and Queequeg are now written as Strawman and Kingqueg. It's not a deal breaker, I obviously know who they're talking about, but it was an odd thing that kept reoccurring. But regardless of what names they use, these characters all come equipped with primary weapons, and they're incredibly unique, not just to each other, but some of these are very unconventional weapons you wouldn't find anywhere else. They're usually ranged weapons with different arcs and ranges, though that's not the case for everything. I've kind of split everything up into some very vague grouping, which don't always mesh, but oh well. With the primary cast, there's only two characters that really come equipped with what you'd call a normal gun. First of these is Henry Fleming, who is our introductory character, and serves as the basic boy. He's the least interesting one here, but at least that means he's easy to use. And much later on we get the Fox, who uses a sniper rifle, and because of that she's most people's favourite. Her range makes her invaluable, but if you're playing right, she'll be on defense more than firing first. The next archetype of swords are characters that use explosions, but even then they're all very different. John Henry's are shot in an arc, Queequeg sends out explosive penguin bombs that just keep shuffling on the ground until they hit something, and Califia just shoots him directly ahead as if it were a normal gun, but with way more in the splash zone. We also have two dedicated supports. Tiger Lily heals by shooting a low-range arcing shot that heals everyone in its area of effect, but the Tin Man heals Steam, which is our primary resource responsible for movement and attacking, and his version of it is a gun that actually shoots into targets one at a time, instead of having a circular area of effect. And we have two more groups left which are much more interesting and also do not fit into the same kind of categorization. This is a much more messy set of them. Lion somersaults onto an enemy, which is a strong attack and serves as a way to access higher vantage points, but it can also just leave you eye to eye with something that wants to kill you. Tom Sawyer punches things with a really weak boxing glove, but it can be used a lot of times and it's good for pushing enemies away. Scarecrow can shoot up these giant pumpkins which serve multiple purposes, such as being a good roadblock or cover, but they can also be used to stun and hurt enemies as these are explosives. Randolph Carter shoots meat out for the aliens, and this gets their attention, which is good for a multitude of reasons that will be explained later. We also have Dorothy, who shoots a lot of really weak attacks at once that travel across the weapon's large horizontal range. It is useless from far away, but when she's right up against her target, this baby does a lot of concentrated damage. And then we have the final group of characters, and these are the ones that won't be seen by most players of the game. 4 of the 5 remaining ones are Fire Emblem characters, who are only usable after scanning for relevant amiibo, and these are Marth, Ike, Robin, and Lucina. The core quartet who are there for Smash Bros. For 3DS and Wii U's launches, and unfortunately the only Fire Emblem amiibo I have are Roy and Byleth, since they're sometimes my boys in Smash Bros, but thanks to the magic of tricking my hacked 3DS into thinking I own pieces of plastic I don't, these 4 unsung heroes of the game did show up, and they're simultaneously unique and derivative. I love them. Marth came to a gunfight with a sword and can only do melee attacks. Great plan. He's my least favourite of the bunch, but I admire the moxie of just implementing this. He is fun, but he doesn't win my vote for most useful ranged attacker. Ike on the other hand brought his axe and his sword, and surprisingly the sword's actually a ranged weapon that actually flings enemies far away. And the melee axe has a wider attacking range, so wide that you can accidentally hit your teammates when they're nearby. He's probably the most fun of these characters due to his 2 very different approaches, but once again he's not super useful as he can team kill. The most useful of these goes to Robin, whose tome has a fantastic range and barely costs anything to use, though it is pretty weak, but you can still get a lot of uses out of it. Oh yeah, and he has a Levin sword, which is pretty good too, but really I use him as a secondary sniper. And then we have Lucina, and she drew the short straw here. She is great to use, but her main attack is just for lions again, though her secondary attack is another cheap to use ranged attack that has an arc to it, so she can deal a fodder from a distance too. The 5th of these neglected 5 is Stovepipe. He is a robotic version of Abraham Lincoln that most people know nothing about, because he is rewarded to you if you dare play this game for as long as I did. He's both a bragging right and something to be ashamed of. He has a decent machine gun and a very powerful melee attack, but really I just like him because he has wheels. So yeah, there are 12 characters most people will see, and 17 in total, with no 2 really feeling the same, except for Lucina, who does need to take some time out and think about what she did. This is a pretty diverse cast, and almost all of them can be customized further. During the course of playing, secondary weapons and new Steam tanks are unlocked, and you can mix and match them on your team to your heart's content. Though the extra 5 characters, the Amiibo and Stovepipe, aren't able to partake in any of this because they're perfect just the way they are. Though really this does mean they do become a bit outclassed later, due to their very limited movement, which is especially a shame for Stovepipe since you will not be using him until he's already outclassed. The secondary weapons are mostly different types of guns, so everyone has a fighting chance here, though some of these serve as other versions of character-specific means. There's a healing gun of sorts, so you can have a medic who isn't Tiger Lily, or get rid of Lovecraft's boy by luring enemies over with this rattle cannon instead. These aren't one-to-one copies either. For example, the healing gun functions more like Tin Man's Steam gun in the fact that it can only be used on one at a time and not on yourself. But it does mean you can have a pocket medic instead of relying on the dedicated one. And thanks to character-specific abilities, the motivation to mix and match the group that you're using at any one time is right there. Tom Sawyer, for example, might be fundamentally weak, but he has a lot of mobility and can even climb onto ledges, and he can be a sneaky scout that heals from a distance if you equip him right. Or Queequeg raises everyone's attack by 20%, so it might be beneficial to pair him up with whoever can make the best use of this. Why bring a guy around who doesn't attack much, when you could just bring 4 of the strongest members at a time and really make the most of that percentage increase? And on top of that, these characters come with their own unique special attack that can only be used once per mission. These are usually devastating attacks which can turn the tide of battle, especially since they can be used the same turn as other attacks. Though some of these are more so supportive or movement-based affairs, each one is given a fitting cinematic that shows more of the character's significance, and also gives a moment to better appreciate this roster. Though some of them, like the imperialist Japanese flag, do make it a little bit harder to appreciate, but hey, if that confuses you, read the bio on why Tin Man in this universe would have a Japanese imperialist flag. They'd put a lot of effort in here to recreate these characters, it's kinda commendable. And the steam tanks are invaluable too, even if they're a bit more standard. They dictate how many actions any character can do at any time. As characters move, their steam depletes, 1 steam puff for every tile moved, and their attacks will take up different amounts of steam based on which weapon it is. It's usually tied to balance, like Tom Sawyer's weak boxing glove uses 1 steam, but much more powerful ones may use 3 or 4 steam. And some later sub-weapons use way more, like the admittedly overpowered Sentry uses 9 whole steam, which may be even more than the character can recharge in a single turn. Actions have consequences. Moving may mean you can't attack, or you can focus on attacking but remain stationary. You generally want to balance this all out so you can do a little bit of both, but this can lead to some fun risks, like staying put to get 1 more shot in. Steam replenishes every turn, so even if you use it all in one big moment, you're not stuck to the ground helpless for long. And one of the mechanics that needs to be taken into advantage with all of this is called Overwatch. If a character has enough steam in their tank during an enemy's turn, and you're wielding one of the weapons capable of it, you can shoot that enemy as it moves into your field of view. In a lot of ways, this is preferable to actually using it on your own turn, since this can stun the enemy and limit their movement and attacking options momentarily. This is what the Fox and her sniper rifle excel in. But to balance it out, enemies can do this too. So whenever you're moving, you can unwittingly walk in front of another enemy's line of sight and be stopped before you can even react. And thanks to the deliberate lack of information conveyed to you, this can make moving a very tense situation. We don't get a map of any kind here. Enemy locations aren't clearly laid out on some kind of radar, you just see them if you see them, and the map design and camera perspective work in tandem to make everything both clear as day and to put us in the character's shoes. We're limited by just what they would be able to see in these sometimes claustrophobic environments with passages everywhere. When an enemy is around a corner, or worse, jumps in front of you from up high, it's startling, but more importantly, it's something that would be lost if it was more conveyed to us. But hey, you can do the same thing to them. It's a level playing field. If you want a good vantage point of enemy locations or the way to the goal, the characters themselves need to get to such a vantage point. Locations aren't just given out for free. It's up to you, the player, to keep track of the enemy locations. And more importantly, it's vital to focus on where they can't attack you. Some enemies shoot projectiles down at the ground, and the only way to be protected is to be under some kind of ceiling at the time. Whereas the opposite can also happen. There are some enemies that spawn from the dirt, so you need to make sure you're avoiding certain patches of dirt wherever possible. This terrain isn't just a visual, it's a gameplay mechanic too. Decorations too, since we can shoot down things like ceiling fans or chandeliers to do massive damage to the enemy, and we also have the classic video game explosive barrels just begging to be shot at. Or if you want to move a little off course, you can sometimes find things like a powerful turret or tank lying in wait all yours for the taking. Both are great ways to bypass the strongest defenses the enemy can muster, but you're also a sitting duck in this big, obvious contraption. And another way that you can be very obvious is if you mess up the stealth mechanic. Surprisingly, that is also another mechanic here. Move slowly with the circle pad and utilize cover to get past, none the wiser to the enemy. The enemy's knowledge of you will be conveyed with a series of visual and audio cues, so you shouldn't be surprised if they suddenly walk right up to where they saw you run past. They told you themselves this was going to happen, so master stealth if you can't take them at that very turn. And stealth can also be used for positioning, which is very important since enemies have weak points to abuse. Anyone can utterly destroy these aliens with precise enough aim. Throw some meat in their way to make sure their weak point is right where you want it. Everything synergizes to make this such a simple, yet deceptively cruel game to master. Launch enemies with weapons that'll be in another player's line of sight, or set up explosives so an impromptu shortcut can be made, and there are so many of these that are just hidden behind initially solid objects, or only accessible to the more agile characters who can climb and jump. The tiles themselves dictate how many spaces you can move, but you're free to move as much as you need to within that small square, and you can aim anywhere possible. This can result in some clutch moments where you're just barely able to get an enemy weak point by abusing the tile and aim system as much as possible. Every step matters, even if not every step counts as actual movement. This is freeform movement applied with a grid overlaid, and it works better than you would ever expect it to. You get better at the game by replaying missions, but unfortunately the implementation of this is flawed, despite some great features that do encourage you to come back. The missions themselves aren't super varied, for every environment they're in is, which masks a lot of what on paper sounds like boring repetition. Most of these end by just getting to a goal point, which requires traveling from point A to point B, and this can be cheesed with things like Dorothy and Lucina's specials, which allow them to dart on by everything. Lucina gets yet another copied ability. Great. But since the maps themselves are so unique, getting from point A to point B never feels like the same task twice. The destination isn't what's fun, it's the journey that is, and the game rewards this by giving you extra points and gold for feats like killing enemies, which in turn leads to more equipment, so you're incentivized to make each trip a bloody one instead of just rushing to the end. But don't dawdle either, since each mission has a target amount of turns, and they don't have to be met, but extra rewards are there if you do achieve it, as well as one for keeping every member of your team alive by mission's end. It's a generous system that rewards mastery but still allows you to take your time, and you're not really punished if you only just barely survive. This is aided with the many save points each map has, however each unique save point can only be used once per mission to prevent cheesing. These save points also allow you to heal and revive party members, though that actually costs money in-game, so you're incentivized not to do this, but it is a good safety net for players that are struggling on a first time through a mission. These save points aren't even an option if you're replaying a mission with the harder modifiers attached. Each mission comes with options to replay with harder rules, and each of these come with a coin multiplier, so it's a good way to grind. But most importantly, these harder modifiers change everyone's colours around, which is why they look different in some footage. Usually it's a simple palette swap, but Rob and Fire Emblem got all decked out for the occasion. But the issue that hinders replayability, at least for me, is the way chapters work. There are 16 chapters across the game, and they all vary in mission amount and complexity. 4 chapters only have a single mission, another 4 chapters have 3 missions, but 8 chapters have 2 missions. At times this balances out, like the opening chapters are smaller, so even if you have more missions within them, they are so quick and easy that they don't drag on. And the 1 chapter missions usually make their appearance quite late in the game, and they're a lot more complex as a result. But still, the 1 mission chapters sometimes feel too short, and the longer 3 mission chapters can overstay their welcome. Say you're in the mood to replay the mission at the army base, Well, to do that, you have to trudge through the 2 missions beforehand, and while they are all cohesively linked, as if you're making your way through to that military base, a single mission select option on replays will be very much appreciated. Sometimes you're in the mood just for mission 3, not missions 1 and 2 as well. And those longer chapters can sometimes feel like a commitment, which has hurt my will to have small dives back in, but clearly not enough since I still did the grind for Stovepipe. Small complaint at the end of the day, but it does rear its head in whenever we go back to it, either to get a better score or to find any of the gears lost in levels. Each mission has 3 gears to find, which are often hidden in devious places that require us explore further, which in turn helps to show us more routes through the levels. Some of these you may not have even been aware of in your first several times through, like breaking walls or climbing onto passages that you didn't know existed. Collecting gears results in more Steam tanks to customize the crew with, so it's in your best interest to dawdle a little bit and find everything. They somehow turned a strategy game into a collectathon, and I just love that. And this gives us incentive to replay missions to get the highest score. Unless you're one of those good at games people who can find all 3 gears and beat the level under par on your first go with everyone alive. But I'd advise against being that good, because these stages beg to be replayed due to how intricate they are and how beautiful everything is. Well, beautiful by the 3DS standards, I mean. Not only do most of these stages feel like believable worlds where everything is contextualized, but the writers had a lot of fun putting in these signs in these human habitats that explain more of the world via jokes about the inconveniences of Steam technology. Whether they be in-universe advertisements or fresh news, the world has more thought put into it than you would expect, and instead of stopping to smell the flowers, I'm here to stop and read the signs. Exploring a little bit off the beaten track can also reward you with extra money, hidden in these gold crates, and regular crates that reward helpful Steam restoratives. Codename Steam is one of those evergreen games where even after I beat it, I feel like I barely scratched the surface. Replayability is where my enjoyment peaked and will likely continue into the future. This isn't WarioWare or Hitman levels to me, where I'm not that obsessed, but it's still pretty high up there where I want to keep replaying until I feel like I've mastered every part of the game. This feels like a game where the scenarios and level design were made in tandem by absolute masters of the craft. The best of these levels are ones that force you to split the team up to do different things at once, and even if they start and end the level together, for the most part you'll be in smaller teams of 1 or 2 members, which not only helps to make each character feel more useful, but it adds more tension since it just means it's easier for the enemy to pick them off one by one. These levels aren't only well-crafted strategy game locations, but they're just so out there that I can't help but love them. Whether they be Victorian England, post-Civil War United States, the land of Oz, as in the Wizard of Oz, not Australia, or the Antarctic, they all feel distinct, memorable, and inviting. This is the Eldritch Abomination hive in the Antarctic I most want to visit, and you can slap that on the box. It's so cozy. It'd be great if this game got a Switch port. It would require very little to change, since everything is basically focused on one screen anyway. The bottom one is usually an afterthought and you can get through pretty much all the game ignoring it, outside of a few menus like selecting character loadouts. During the main game, it's basically just there to mirror things that other physical buttons already provide, like switching characters or adjusting your aim. It's one of the many games on single-stick handhelds which has us aim with the face buttons, which is usually very awkward and never precise enough. Though here it isn't really much of an issue due to time being basically frozen. You can take as long as you want to line up those shots, and this is compatible with the new 3DS nub, so you can use that if you prefer, but really if I need that very precise movement, the bottom screen is a better way to move the camera freely. Just move this virtual representation of a stick, and it does work well since the game is turn-based and doesn't need quick reflexes. This isn't a Mario 64 DS situation at all. And Mario 64 DS doesn't have first-person mecha sections where we drill into an alien's body with a drill arm, like Codename Steam does, and these sections really do put to light the sense of scale one of these mechas would have, even if the gameplay is just kind of eh. I love Codename Steam, and there's nothing I can't praise. Well, actually there's 2 things, but that's not because I have complaints, I just have nothing to say. There are street pass features and online multiplayer, and they're not the most popular things in 2022, so I didn't get to try them. It would be great if a Switch port came out to bring the online back to life. All it would really take is an up-res and redrawn UI, but it will likely never happen since no one bought this game, and all 5 people who remember it just know it as that failure that reviewed poorly and sold even worse. I've seen a lot of video games go from virtually unknown to becoming such beloved cult classics. Even if you've never played them, you're at least aware of them and their reputation. But I've also seen games go from popular staples to being forgotten about as the generations have changed. Time is always flowing, and what is considered a hidden gem, cult classic, or even a beloved game to the masses will always be in fluctuation. Perhaps in 20 years, people will start to treat Codename Steam the way games like Earthbound are beloved now, or maybe this will just continue to be ignored. Realistically, this game will be a game no one ever cares about in the future. At best, it'll be seen as that failed experiment and put alongside the other failures of Nintendo. A lot of great games are never truly appreciated, and it's just as likely a game ignored at release will stay that way for the rest of time. Codename Steam will probably see that same fate, but I can only hope it rises above it and becomes a beloved classic for generations to come. That was depressing. Games aren't all fun and games, you know.